So what we're going to look at now in the second part is America's now a great power. This is post-Spanish-American War. The United States now is an equal power, and what do we kind of do with this power? So we're going to look about our growing influence. We're going to look at how we dealt with South America, and then we're definitely going to focus, and the most important piece are the foreign policies of the presidents. So a sphere of influence, that's the one I'm going to go over. This is just it means an area that is controlled or dominated by an outside power. Usually they don't actually control it. It's not like they own that area, but they have a say in what goes on there. So, post-Spanish-American War, the United States is now on equal footing with the Europeans. We are a great power. We have joined that club of the big European powers, and we have two goals. We want to acquire new markets. We already went over that in the previous one. And we want national security. We want to make sure that we can protect our world power status now. If you look at the magazine over here, you can see the United States, this is supposed to represent the U.S., is trying on being a world power. And if you see the smoke, it says expansion. That's what the U.S. is looking for. So one of the big things was China. China had been split by the Europeans into spheres of influence where each European nation controlled a trading area. And the U.S. didn't like this because we want our classic goal. We want access to markets. We want to be able to sell things in China. There's a lot of people in China. There's a lot of people to sell things to. So that was the entire goal. So what the United States does is when the Chinese have a rebellion called the Boxer Rebellion that threatens foreigners in China, the United States decides to join in, and we join in with the Europeans. Us, the Japanese, and the Europeans together come together and they put down the rebellion, and we put down the rebellion fairly hard. The result of this, the U.S. is more involved in China, and we kind of get a say now in what goes on in China. So what our say is we come up with, and you should definitely understand this one or take a note of it, the open door policy. This means that all of Chinese markets are an open door. Instead of spheres of influence where each European has a certain area that it controls, the United States makes the argument that, hey, there's more than enough Chinese for everybody to be able to buy and sell things in China. So China should still be an independent country, but everybody has access to their trade. It's pretty successful. The U.S. begins to trade with China. We have those access to markets. We're able to get what we want. So this is just the Boxer Rebellion here. The U.S. was actually the first country to storm the walls of Beijing. It kind of made us look good in the eyes of the rest of the Europeans, gave us a little more prestige. Our big one is with Japan. So the United States had this belief that the Japanese were basically the Americans in Asia. We believed they were the superior Asian nation. We saw them as a natural ally. What begins to happen, though, there begins to be a rivalry between the United States and the Japanese. And if you know history at all, this rivalry does not end up good. The United States treated Japanese immigrants really bad. There's a lot of racist policies towards them. And the Japanese were building their own empire to try and expand their kind of goals. This creates a rivalry between the two that is going to last all the way till 1945. What the United States does, we've gone on over this before, we send out the Great White Fleet. You can see it here. The idea is we're sending a message to Japan that we're stronger than you. You don't want to mess with us. We are kind of the ones in charge in this area. In Latin America, the United States declares pretty much everything in Latin America its zone of influence. Or sphere of influence, sorry. What this means is that the United States, and if you look here, the Europeans have to be hands off in Latin America. They cannot touch Latin America. So we use the Monroe Doctrine, which we went over before. Europeans can't create any new colonies in Latin America. The U.S. businesses are the ones who are going to be dominant in Latin America. And throughout the 1800s and 1900s, we get more and more involved down there. Our companies invest down there. We make more money down there because it's our backyard. That's how we view it. It's our sphere of influence. It's where we're in control. Puerto Rico's kind of added on to that. I'm not going to focus a ton on this. These two acts I'm not going to quiz you on, but what we do with Puerto Rico, we take it during the Spanish-American War, we already went over this, and we make it a U.S. territory. We turn it into part of the United States. Cuba is another important piece. We've gone over this a lot. During the Spanish-American War, again, we help Cuba gain its independence, but then what we add is we add these two amendments. The Teller Amendment says we won't annex Cuba. We promise we won't make it part of the United States. But what we add, and think of this as kind of an asterisk, we add the Platt Amendment onto the Cuban Constitution. And this is in Cuba's constitution, and it says that the U.S. can intervene to keep Cuba independent. So whenever Cuba's independence is threatened, the United States is allowed to send its military down there and help keep it independent. While that sounds good, what this does it has these two pieces. It basically puts the United States in charge of Cuba. We get to approve any treaties that Cuba makes. We also get to take Cuban naval ports and keep them. So while Cuba's not part of the United States, it's basically controlled by the United States. It brings it into our sphere of influence, and we're going to use it to project our power into Latin America. So this is where you should focus most of your time, and this is what you're going to study a little more in depth in session 7. Roosevelt's, Taft, and Wilson's foreign policies. Remember, foreign policy is what deals with other countries. So Roosevelt believed in a foreign policy called the Big Stick. It is a more aggressive foreign policy. He wants to use the U.S. military. So he believes in this part here. U.S. isn't going to start fights, but it's going to be prepared for them. So it comes from the saying, speak softly, carry a big stick. The idea is you have a big stick in your hand, the U.S. military, in case you need to use it, but you're not going to use it. Taft, who's president after Roosevelt, he goes through this idea called dollar diplomacy. He wants to use dollars instead of bullets. So instead of the big stick, instead of the U.S. military to push the U.S.'s ideas, he is going to try and use the U.S. economy to influence nations. Investment, sending U.S. businesses down there, buying from other countries, and he's going to use that to have leverage. President Wilson believes in moral diplomacy. He wants to expand democracy. So what he says is we're going to do away with this idea of the big stick and dollar diplomacy and influencing other nations. What we're going to focus on is we're going to support nations if they're democratic. We're going to spread democracy, and then we're only going to work with nations who are democratic. So Wilson's big stick is fairly simple. You can see it here. Roosevelt's big stick. Here's Teddy Roosevelt. He's on one of the Great White Fleet, and he has the big stick, the American military. He adds what's called the Roosevelt Corollary to the Monroe Doctrine. Think of this as a Post-it note tacked on to the Monroe Doctrine, and it makes the United States the police in the Western Hemisphere. So whenever there is a problem in South America or Latin America or in the Caribbean, the United States is the one who's going to take care of it. And that keeps the Europeans out of South America. They don't have a reason to come down there. That keeps South America under the U.S.'s control. He builds the Panama Canal. This allows the United States to move its warships from coast to coast. This is the best example of the big stick, by the way. Colombia wouldn't give us the canal, the area to build the canal when we wanted it. So the United States supported Panama in their War of Independence. Panama, in turn, turns around, gives us the canal zone as kind of a reward for helping them. It's classic big stick. We got what we wanted. We didn't start the battle. We didn't start the fight, but we finished it with our military. The result of the big stick policy is that the United States is the dominant power in the Western Hemisphere. We get what we want in Panama. We're controlling South America. We don't start fights, but then again, we use our military to end them. Taft switches gears, like we said. He uses dollar diplomacy. His thing is he wants to use U.S. corporations to influence. So he does lots of investment in projects in Latin America, building ports, building roads, railroads. They're then owned by American corporations. They're bringing money into these South American nations, and that allows the United States to have influence over those South American nations. This doesn't work, though. It's a major failure. what it causes is the South American nations don't like this because they feel like the U.S. is basically taking over their countries. They feel like the U.S. is kind of controlling their economy. So they push back against it. The last one is Wilson's moral diplomacy. Again, Wilson is very much a social Darwinist. He believes that the United States needs to teach other nations to be democracies, that we need to bring our civilization to other nations. And what he'll do is interventions. Whenever you see the word intervention in U.S. history, you can just substitute it for invasion. The United States invades to support democracy in Mexico in 1914, Haiti in 1915, Dominican Republic in 1916, Cuba in 1917, Panama in 1918, and Mexico in 1916 through 1917. So even though Wilson is saying that he's going to be moral and he's not going to do these interventions and kind of meddle in other countries, he sends the troops, U.S. troops, to meddle in other countries a lot. Usually it's after a country can't pay its debts, or there's a rebellion that is, threatening some country's democratic president. And what happens is Wilson begins to send troops to restore order and spread democracy in those countries. So what I want you to do is think about which style of diplomacy was the best for the United States post-Spanish-American War. What worked the best for the United States? And as usual, if you have any questions, please let me know.